Okay, I think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. First of all, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day to all of you, and welcome to our fifth webinar in today's series of Global Accessibility Awareness Day webinars. Thank you so much for joining. Before we get started, I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So first of all, this session will be live captioned. We have Bonnie from a la carte joining us this morning. You will get a little prompt to ask whether the closed captioning should be enabled for you. If you want the closed captioning, just press the yes button underneath. The recording will also be made available afterwards to download, and so the goal for today's session is mostly for it to be I really want this to be a group discussion, a group interview. So I would encourage everyone to post questions, post thoughts in the chat window. I'll be monitoring it, and we have some other people from Blackboard joining today that will be monitoring it as well. And we will be relaying those questions to Lucy and make them part of the interview. Okay, let me just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Nicolaas Matthijs. I'm originally Belgian. I'm based in London, but I'm currently calling you from Denver, where it actually just started snowing. I've been in educational technology for about 12 years now. I've worked at a number of different institutions, such as Cambridge University in the UK, Georgia Tech, UC Berkeley. But I was also the co-founder of Ally, which has now been incorporated by Blackboard, which is our sort of brand new product to help make that really focuses on helping make digital course content more accessible. And so today I'm very excited to be that we get to interview Lucy Greco, who's a web accessibility evangelist at UC Berkeley and a leading figure, I would say, in the overall accessibility community. So Lucy, welcome. First of all, thank you for joining so early in your day. And because I wouldn't do an introduction of yourself justice, so I'm going to let you talk a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and how you get started in the field of accessibility. Lucy, I think your microphone is muted.
There you go. Thank you, Nico. Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day to everyone. I'm really very excited. This is my 5th of 6 Global Accessibility Awareness Days. So as Nico said, I am an accessibility evangelist, which means I work with people who are new to accessibility and teach them about what the power of accessibility is, how to incorporate accessibility into their work. My favorite part of my job is working with developers, teaching them how to create more accessible, more interactive, enjoyable tools. But I also work on policy, and I work on helping the institution make decisions on accessibility. I work at UC Berkeley. I've been there for about 12 years now. And prior to that, I trained people on how to use assistive technology. And my real favorite job before that was working as a living skills instructor, teaching people how to cook.
That's great. Do you want us to say a little bit more about how you got involved in the field of accessibility?
Sure. So as a sorry, I'm getting a little bit of echo there. I am a blind person. I'm totally blind myself, and going through K-12 was a very challenging thing for me. I didn't have the accommodations that students do today. Most of my work was done in Braille with an interliner or on a typewriter with somebody sitting behind me shredding up the pages if I made too many mistakes and correcting the errors I typed. So when computers became available with speech synthesis in the mid-'80s, I immediately jumped on board that bandwagon and then became the people that everyone person, sorry, that everyone came to for assistance with computers later on, I felt that I could not get through college without going on a computer. You know, being able to write something up in a word processor, being able to look things up on the internet, very key, very important. But when I became the one that everyone turned to, it became a natural turn of events that I became a trainer, actually got a job as that, and then started at UC Berkeley working with students, teaching students how to use assistive technologies.
That's great. And I know you're also involved in many different accessibility groups and organizations. Can you describe a little bit like which different organizations you're actively involved in?
Sure. So I do a lot of advocacy work. I do work specifically with Lainey Feingold quite a bit, who is probably one of the top accessibility lawyers, who's created several settlements for accessibility. And I've either been one of the people as a claimant on one of her cases, or I've been the technological advisor on several cases. I work with the San Francisco Lighthouse. I sit on the Lighthouse Labs Advisory Board, which is a group that has different products brought to us, and we advise the developers of those products on what they can do to make those more accessible, or if, you know, a lot of people come to us with the new great idea for a blind person, and we help them understand what the real great idea the blind person needs is. I've participated in the past with ACB, NFB, and I do a lot of work with legal advocacy. So recently I've done some work as the primary litigant in the Lyft case for guide dog users.
That's awesome. So the main sort of topic for today's conversation is going to be accessibility policy at higher education institutions. So in order to get started with it, Lucy, do you want to describe what policies are currently in place at UC Berkeley and how they came into existence?
Sure. So we have a fairly straightforward policy at UC Berkeley. The policy was created at the UC-wide level for the whole University of California. It was a fairly intensive process for a very simple, straightforward policy. We started looking at creating a policy in late 2005, and by 2013 we had something in place. So again, a very long process. We started by writing up a policy that laid out some very direct, specific activities that needed to happen when it came to accessibility. It was very sharp, very firm. It was, you must do, you will do, these people will do, this is the types of roles that need to be put in place, and we failed. In 2007, we presented that policy and nobody would back it, primarily because we had a lot of things in place that were mandates in that policy, but we had no source of funding for those mandates. And accessibility, as we all know who are in education, often is an unfunded mandate. It is something that we have to do, and it's very, very difficult to get funding for. So when the policy failed, we kind of said, well, what are we going to do now? We need to have something, because people won't start working on this without policy. There's a mandate, but they don't understand the mandate. So what we did was we redesigned that policy, and it was very straightforward. And we gave a guideline, and we kind of took out some of the things that people disliked. So what our policy currently states is that as an institution, we strive for accessibility, and all of our accessibility work must be moving forward. So we're not going to go backwards and start making our content from the 90s accessible. That's counterproductive as far as we were concerned. We couldn't say that every single website, every single document, piece of content must be made accessible, and that's where we had a lot of pushback. So we said, moving forward, we need some accessibility. Stand in front of Page. It's way better. And in this moving forward, it said that if you purchase anything, that purchase must be made accessible. If you do any work on new technology, you must focus on accessibility in that work. It must be part of what you do. So our policy is very straightforward. Again, like I said, we said that we will strive to reach the W3C 2.0 AA level of accessibility. And we did not put any timeline on this because all we said was we wanted this to be a moving forward progress. So, a lot of institutions have made policies that say within 5 years our content will be accessible. We did not put that kind of mandate in there because frankly, we weren't able to get buy-in. We just said that teams working on technology of any sort need to consider accessibility and need to move those products forward for accessibility. So then the second part of our policy is now we're starting to do implementation type policy. So we've included a purchasing guidelines for accessibility. And we have a questionnaire that we want included in every single purchase that's made at the institution. And the questionnaire includes what I call the mood questions. There's about 5 or 7 questions, I can never remember exactly how many, that help the people who are running the RFP or purchasing the product to understand what the company they're buying from's policies are, kind of get a sense and a feel for the company, see if they pass the smell test. Do they actually care about accessibility or not? And then we have a W3C checklist. And most importantly in our checklist, we have a category for if the product complies, partially complies, or does not comply. And then we have a column that says in that checklist, if you do not comply or partially comply, what are the known workarounds and what is the roadmap for remediation for these particular products? So again, we're looking for things that move forward and things that progress. And what I tell people when I talk to them about using our purchasing guidelines is the only column you really care about is that last column that says, what are the workarounds, what remediations need to be done, and what is the roadmap? And then I tell them, if you're going to buy something that fails accessibility, you need to look at that last column and you need to figure out how much it's going to cost you to accommodate students, accommodate staff, anybody with disabilities who's going to be using this product. And the only way you can be permitted to buy that product is you have to have a budget in place for those accommodations. So, if the product requires that somebody sighted help a blind person use it, your budget for purchasing that product needs to include the salary of that person who's going to be there to do that accommodation. So maybe a little bit more than you were looking for, but that's the scope of our policy. We're just starting to work on employment standards next. So in about another year, I'll be able to tell you about how we're going to be hiring people with accessibility and how we're going to be looking at improving people who work for our accessibility skill sets.
That's awesome. That was exactly what I was looking for. Thank you, Lucy. So we did have one question in chat, which is, so when you were talking about the sort of RFP sort of procurement checklist and the different questions that are being asked, is that a resource that can be shared?
Absolutely. That is available on the University of California Office of the President website under Electronic Accessibility Committee. And we have a section on purchasing, and the checklist is actually right available there. The only thing that's not listed there publicly is what we consider our showstoppers. The things that if a vendor says no to, it's a critical problem. That's only because we don't want to discourage people from applying and bidding.
That makes sense, and we'll make sure that we post a link to that page as well. Okay, so it's already in chat. One question that I had, Lucy, is so how would you compare the UC Berkeley policy to other institutional policies that you've seen? Are you seeing a lot of alignment between policies, or are you seeing major differences between different policies?
So the biggest alignment is that we're all following W3C 2.0 AA. And I think that's because it's actually a very stable, very international, very well accepted, easy to follow standard. So that's where the similarity ends, I think. Again, our policy doesn't have very many mandates. Our policy is very much a moving forward policy, which is very different. I mean, again, I've seen a lot of schools say, this is our roadmap. These are the years that we will have to complete this process.
Okay. And then we did have a question in chat from Eric. So basically, which is around the sort of OCR DOJ agreements that have been coming up lately. So before we jump into that question, what would you say that the role of the DOJ has been in all of this, and can you sort of describe what they have done and how it has influenced things?
So when we were considering the policy, we did look very closely at what was going on legally and politically across the country. And that's how we actually determined that we were going to follow we were not going to follow Section 508, and we were going to follow W3C. We knew that eventually W3C was going to be the standard that everybody else was going to be following. And we didn't want to have to rework our entire policy after like I said, it took us 9 years to get the thing approved. We didn't want to have to re-go through the whole process. So that's why we went for W3C. But I've been looking at what's been going on with DOJ throughout the country, and I think there's been a lot of positive effect from it. I mean, as a person who is an advocate for people with disabilities, a person with a disability, I can't help but praise some of the work that the DOJ has done. I mean, we're getting institutions that are looking at accessibility very differently than they ever have in the past. Institutions are funding this mandate finally. Institutions are looking at staff issues with disabilities as well as students. I mean, I look at the Pennsylvania state case where Pennsylvania was told staff had to be included in their accessibility initiatives. It was not only educational content, it was all the devices used on campus by everyone. The DOJ has done some really excellent work about laying out guidelines. We're very disappointed in the community about the fact that we don't have a rulemaking yet. I'm very frustrated about that. Legal cases are very frustrated about that. We don't know what to do at this point in time because we don't have any guidelines, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. Nobody knows what the next administration or the current administration is thinking about accessibility. But I think what we should do is we should look at what the positive wins we've had are and use those DOJ cases for guidance in how we create our own policies. I mean, I look at every single case that's been published in the past 5 years, and all of those cases have a lot of similarities. You can see those cases at DeWitt from the University of Washington has a very good summary of what those similarities are. I believe Karen, I do not remember which Karen it is. Sorry, I will send the link to Nico and he can post that with the recording later. Also has a summary of what's happened in all the DOJ cases, but I can give it to you in a really brief summary that every single case says that you must have a coordinator of accessibility on a campus, and every single case says that you must hire people with accessibility knowledge. Every single case says that you must purchase products with accessibility, and they all say W3C AA standard. So, there's the beginning of a policy for you right there.
And there was an additional question. Do you have any concerns around the fact that your policy doesn't specify or doesn't commit to a timeline in terms of improving certain things? And do you think that that is still acceptable at this point from a DOJ point of view? This is my personal opinion right now. I'm not representing UC Berkeley in any way.
But our policy says moving forward. It says that nothing new that's created and nothing new that we purchase can be accessible, or can be inaccessible, sorry. So I feel that we are actually complying with that because we all replace technology as we go. And if we replace that technology with only accessible, that's better than a 5-year guideline or, a 2-year timeline, because the old stuff has to be replaced. It's all, not serving the need anymore. So I feel that I think we are in compliance with that. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think is a good example of a very very proactive, very future-looking, very realistic approach to take. So one thing that I wanted to come back to, Lucy, is the sort of requirements that the policy puts in place around RFPs and procurement. I was wondering, have you seen any, over the last 5 years, let's say, have you seen a very noticeable improvement in terms of what's actually arriving on your desk, in terms of tools that are being evaluated and how accessible they are, or is there still a lot of work to be done?
There's tons of work to be done, but there is improvement. To answer the question 2 ways. The big players in the industry are actually all making significant improvements. I remember first testing an Oracle product, for example, 4 years ago, and being completely frustrated at my inability to use that product. Having to go through all forms of, machinations, jumping on my head and twisting around and doing all kinds of funny things, and finally finding a sighted person to do some of the tasks I needed to do. Whereas the new Oracle products are actually much more accessible. I'm not going to say they're perfect, but they are definitely moving towards an accessibility model much more quickly, and that is for the big players. The Microsofts, the Googles. I remember when we first contracted with Google at Berkeley, as a blind person, I was not able to use Google Docs. But as part of our contract, we insisted that they work on some more accessibility in their products for the future. So I'm just moving further away from the noise in the background. I'm sorry if the camera's wiggling too much. So we insisted in our contract that part of the contract was that they needed to actually improve their accessibility. And this is something that we're doing with all of our vendors now. That, if we find an inaccessible product that is a product that actually meets our needs in every other regard, my team's services are offered to that vendor for them to improve their product, to make it more accessible, to make it much more, usable by everyone. So within a year, we went from that inaccessible Google Doc to something that I actually use as a default now because I actually prefer it. And working with vendors and partnering with them is the only way I think we're going to get accessibility. The little players, they're still kind of tough to work with. I spoke to a sister institution just a couple of weeks ago where the vendor is just literally holding their stance, saying, we're not going to do anything for accessibility. We're not helping you. You're making demands that no other institution are making on us. Why should we make this product accessible? And my answer is to every single institute on this webinar is you'd better be making those demands of your vendors, and you'd better be holding their feet to the fire, because if we don't all have a consistent story that we're telling them, vendors are going to be able to get away with that from now on.
And so there's a question on what are some of those? Can you give some examples in terms of those demands?
The first thing we need to demand is that accessibility is important. We need to say that, even if it's a product that we think has very limited use, that it's really key and very important that it be accessible. I mean, a lot of institutions have said, oh, only our staff work with these products, so we don't have to worry about those. Well, that's not the case. We all have to hire people with disabilities. I mean, in the US, there is a requirement that you hire a certain percentage of your staff with disabilities. Well, if you start buying stuff that's inaccessible, that percentage of your staff is not going to be able to use the products in question. So the demands are that you want those products to be accessible. And if the products aren't accessible today, the demands you must make are, tell us when you're going to make it accessible, tell us how you're going to make it accessible, and then hold their feet to the fire and say, it's in the contract language. You know, you said you would make this application keyboard accessible within 6 months. Well, it's now 7 months. You violated your contract. Pay us the penalty or the contract is canceled.
Makes sense. Yeah. And is there, what do you think is, I mean, it sounds like there's a possibility there or an opportunity there for institutions to be more aligned in this area and basically very consistently demand certain accessibility related things from vendors. Are you seeing any vehicles or any ways in which we can, or in which that alignment can happen, or any groups that could help with that sort of consistent, like requiring consistent accessibility related demands?
This is why we published our guidelines online. This is why we have them very clearly posted and very openly. I don't care who uses that particular purchasing guideline. In fact, the sister institution I talked about that contacted me, you know, they're using our guidelines. I say to everyone, yeah, we did the work to write up those purchasing guidelines. Everybody's free to use those. Collaborate with your other institutions. Join groups like Athens, join groups like the EDUCAUSE Accessibility List, and talk to your peers and all make sure that you have a consistent message.
Absolutely. And so if you're looking at, when you're looking at different products that are coming in and working with vendors, are there specific types of issues that are especially challenging or are especially common, or are you seeing a very wide range in terms of issues that still exist today?
Screen reader accessibility is getting better in general, but when it comes to things like visualization products, these are the big kind of barrier today. You know, it's how do you make infographics accessible? How do you use a product like Tableau to get something accessible? Those are kind of like the things that we have not been able to solve as of yet. There are getting to be much better tools out there, and I've worked with a couple of vendors that have actually come up with really innovative, clever ways, but it's not spreading wide enough yet because people still are stuck on the concept and idea that, well, it's a visualization, you cannot make it accessible. STEM is very critical right now. We are about to reach an era where accessibility for STEM is actually reachable and actually achievable. But, you know, companies that are making products for STEM are still not thinking about accessibility in their development stage. You know, we're not yet at the point where everybody is thinking about born accessible content.
Right. So coming back to the UC Berkeley policy, would you say that now that this policy is in place, has that made sort of a very successful impact on the or difference in terms of the day-to-day activities?
We are definitely getting a much bigger influx of people who are interested. The big challenge is communication, getting the information to people where they are when they need it. Having people realize that, first of all, there is a policy is the big problem. And when they do, people are more than willing to comply. And, you know, the big question they have is not why, but how. So getting the information that there is something they have to comply with out to them, and then getting the information about where the resources are is the big challenge. But yes, I am definitely seeing a huge change. I'm not going to say that we're done. We're never done because we have to keep moving and we need to progressing. But people are starting to understand, and people are starting to question and ask for help.
Excellent. And what do you think is the most effective way of doing some of that communication towards the institution? Like, what is your sense that what's the most successful message that you can send out, or how do you send out that message so that it's picked up on?
Word of mouth has been the most successful for me, grassroots type things where people come to meetings and then they get the bug, they get the virus. This is why I chose the title evangelist for myself, is because I teach people to believe, and I teach people to understand in accessibility and realize the benefits to not only people with disabilities. And then I find that those people will go out and talk to other people in the community and get them on board and help them understand the concepts. I could do a huge publicity campaign and push a lot more, but I think people don't buy into it as much as they do through word of mouth and grassroots. I mean, our program at Berkeley was actually a voluntary program for many years before my position was created as it is. And we would have a group of people who met once a week, and we would have, somebody would bring cake, somebody would bring coffee, and then we would review a website. And that group grew from a corp of 5 people to eventually having 250 people on our mailing list. It's the way you grow, and people would constantly be bringing other people in and saying, you should actually get your website reviewed for accessibility by these people. And did you know that if you actually made your website more accessible, that you would increase your SEO? Things like that were very effective. And I think it's maybe not scalable at a large university as well as it should be, but it's at least affordable. And again, remember, we're talking mandates that are not funded most of the time.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question in chat as well on how does the policy coordinate accessibility efforts across the campus and different departments, different responsibilities?
The policy doesn't address it at all, actually. In our communications and in our actual operating principles, we say that each individual functional owner of a product or an activity are the ones responsible for accessibility, and they're the ones for funding that activity. So if a unit buys this piece of software that the rest of the campus is going to use, they're the ones for making that particular product accessible or paying for the accommodations. So say you were, I'm going to try and come up with an example that doesn't point to anything. Say you were a unit on campus that was selling water dispensers to the rest of the campus. You're the one responsible for making sure that water dispenser is accessible. And if, say, that water dispenser was not wheelchair accessible, then you would have to be the people paying for the fact that somebody has to stand there and hand it to a person in a wheelchair, hand their water glass to a person in the wheelchair. And no, we do not have water dispensers at Berkeley that are being sold by an individual unit. I'm just trying to come up with a very generic example. So the unit that owns those water dispensers has to pay for the person to get the water to the person in the wheelchair.
Right, and that's presumably also where that sort of grassroots approach come in, where over time you start to have people that care about accessibility and sort of make it their responsibility in all of those different places in the organization. Is there any sort of active outreach that you do for departments that may be trailing or may not be following some of the things that are inside of the policy?
No, we don't go after units specifically. I mean, there is a compliance unit, but my team is intentionally separate from that compliance unit. We want people to come to us for help. So we intentionally say we are not compliance. We don't want somebody bringing us their website with a fear that, if it's inaccessible, they're going to get in trouble. We're the unit that helps fix problems. And at this point in time, we are so overwhelmed with demand that we can't actually go out and advertise because we have too many customers coming to us for more. If somebody complains to the compliance unit will send them to our way. In fact, the complaint process actually specifically points out that the web team or our technology team receiving the complaint should come to our unit. But we don't go after somebody and saying, hey, you have this water dispenser that's inaccessible, and this is, we can help you fix it. They have to come to us and say, can you help us fix our water dispenser?
That makes sense. So zooming a little bit out, Lucy, and sort of looking at institutions more broadly. Let's say there's an institution that doesn't have an accessibility policy yet. How would you convince that institution that they need to have a policy in place, and how would you convince them that it's important and that it matters?
The first thing I would do is I would say, look at your student population, and do you want to diversify that student population? A big theme in education is diversity. We think that it's very important for our students and the members of our community to have a diverse environment. I mean, educational institutions are very liberal. They want people to be diverse because they want people to have a variety of experiences. So then talk to them about the fact that a lot of the things they are doing, because they don't have a policy, are excluding a major portion of the population. Then I would also talk to the institution about the fact that, and if you do start thinking about accessibility and fixing accessibility issues, the population you have without disabilities are going to benefit as well. Inevitably, every time I find a product that has an accessibility issue, everyone else who is using that product hates it, or finds it difficult, or struggles, or can't understand. The most inaccessible application I have ever used, everybody else finds that product very difficult to use, very confusing. I remember somebody saying, oh yeah, that piece of software, I have to go through job aids every time I have to fill out a form on that thing because the forms are completely incomprehensible and they're not understandable. Whereas if the application was more accessible, I can guarantee that people would actually be able to use it more effectively, more quickly. You wouldn't have to provide as many job aids. I mean, the cost savings is immense when you make something simpler and more accessible. And by having a policy, you're actually saving money. I mean, people think, oh, I have to spend all this money on accessibility. Well, if you do it up front and you have a policy that mandates that you're doing the accessibility in what I call the born accessible way, you're actually saving money and you're saving time and energy and effort for everyone. So no, accessibility doesn't cost. It costs if you wait. It costs if you delay, or if you eventually get that knock on the door from the Department of Justice. Now you're having to pay your lawyers and you're having to pay your defense team, and inevitably you're going to lose, and you're going to end up paying 7 times more than if you just had a policy in place that fostered accessibility and fostered inclusiveness and got things done in the right way, and people could get their jobs done more effectively, use the tools, and the tools you have are the most appropriate tools that are required for the task.
Right.
Did I sell you?
Yeah, and I actually quite like that answer, because you primarily focused on getting greater variety in terms of student population, things like easier to use systems in general, things like cost savings. I think you very deliberately didn't use the legal stick as part of the reasoning as why this is important. And I think that can also help internationally, so outside of the US, where that legal stick is not as strong, getting that more positive story, I think can be very valuable.
Yeah, I hate using the legal stick. I mean, it is there at the end, but it's not. There are countries where there is no legal mandate, but everybody hates a product that is poorly designed. Everybody hates it. If you can't see something because the contrast is so poor, you can't use the tool, or the amount of time you spend on that tool is just far too time consuming. The money we waste on inaccessible tools for everyone, not only people with disabilities, is, millions could be saved if we spend less time doing our jobs.
Okay, and so again, talking about that institution that doesn't have a policy in place yet and is trying to get one in place. So convincing the institution that they need a policy is one important step in that process. But then I guess a next step would be to convince the faculty that this is important and it's not just an extra thing they have to do. Do you have any tips and advice on how to approach that there, or any sort of examples of challenges that you've run into there?
The best thing to do with faculty is to realize that they are quite vain and realize that their goal is to teach. And if you work with faculty and help them understand that they're not reaching the students and they're not getting the students' attention, usually their vanity kicks in and they like, well, I want to teach. That's why I'm teaching. And if I'm not doing my job for every student, then I need to improve. And I think, working with a faculty member and saying, if you only did this, more students would understand. They tend to be much more willing and much more innovative. We also like to point out the fact that the faculties that have more accessible content tend to be the ones who are the most popular faculty and have the largest enrollments in their classes. Very few faculty don't want students to enroll in their classes.
That makes sense, and very often just showing them goes a very long way. That's definitely my experience as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find that faculty really do care. I mean, they do. They're not there because they want to stand in front of a classroom and talk to a bunch of freshmen. They're there because they want to share what they know, and and especially at Berkeley, we've got so many really innovative people who are interested in research. I mean, you think, oh, an English literature professor doesn't really care about accessibility, but they actually do. They really do, because they want a way to communicate their message and help people understand the message in the literature they're teaching. So it's just another way of, using their own passion against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as part of the development of Ally, we're seeing something very similar. That while there's always faculty that will not be interested, but most faculty do really care. And if you show them how they're doing, if you give them feedback about how they're doing, if you explain them why something is important and how it can affect all students, that will get you a very long way. And as you say, my impression has also been that most faculty do genuinely care.
Well, and the other thing is that I don't focus necessarily on the accessibility when I talk about accessibility. I mean, I talk to a professor about, you've posted 31 documents for your students to go through, and it's now time for finals, and those students need to find the key points from the lecture. And you've told them, these are the things that'll be on the exam. Do you want them to spend 100 hours going through those 30 documents? Or the time they really have where they could search those documents and find those documents and use them much more effectively and find those 10 points that will be on the final exam in those 30 documents. And if the documents are accessible, they're more searchable and more usable. And oh, by the way, if you wanted to review what the document said, you could search through them and use them more effectively.
Right. Absolutely. And we just got another question, which I think I'd like to hear your opinion on. Is so there's Matt from Ottawa University saying that his university is very small with a very limited budget. What are some of the low-hanging fruit things that they can do in terms of accessibility to what are some of the low-hanging fruit things that they can do?
So the low-hanging fruit thing you can do is you can utilize the resources you already have on campus. You have a library, I'm assuming. If you have a library, that library has subscriptions to periodicals, all the rest of that. Your library can demand that accessibility from the publishers, and a lot of the publishers are starting to move towards more accessible formats. So you can teach your faculty, instead of having them scan articles and post them on the learning management system. You can teach your articles to link to the library resources that are more accessible. That's a huge, huge win right there. Your campus is already paying for those licenses. I think of the problem that we've noticed here in the past 10 years with, we're trying to get the cost of education to be more affordable, textbook affordability. Instructors would create course readers, and these course readers would need to be copyright approved, and so they would cost, I had students telling me they were paying $210 for, this huge course reader, which was photocopied articles from a faculty member, whereas the chances were every single article that was in that course reader was actually in a subscription in the library. Unless it was something that the professor themselves wrote and never published, a professor's not going to publish their work. That, the chances are it's in the library. If it's in the library, we can point to it. Students aren't going to have to pay for their course reader. Your campus is already spending that money. Use it effectively. And then, other low-hanging fruit is form a community of practice. Form a brown bag lunch sessions where people can go through and review. Find an employee with a disability who can help you review things. Use your own disabled students. Hire them for work study. We're all offering work study to our students. Find a student with a disability who can help you actually test for accessibility. Don't try testing without a person with a disability, but find a real person with a disability to help you.
And another thing that seems very important in all of this, Lucy, is how to effectively connect accessibility to something like instructional design. And so are you, at Berkeley, are you like partnering with any parts of the organization to help make that bridge more effectively?
Our unit is nothing but partnership. I have many partners on campus, from a faculty member trying to create an innovative statistics course. We partner with them, but we partner with our educational technologies unit, that any purchases they make, they bring to us. We teach them how to have it be more accessible. They're the ones they're the ones who are responsible for that product. So they also know how to use that product, and they actually can help individuals with disabilities use that product, because we've taught them through our partnership how the actual product works with assistive technology. We have our online educational resource center. We partner with them quite closely. They're the ones who've created templates for faculty for online education, and those templates they've created in a very accessible way. This is where the hiring of people with accessibility knowledge is key. They specifically hired somebody who had an accessibility background to lead their educational technology team to become more accessible. He is the accessibility lead, and he has created the templates that faculty can use that are by default accessible. Faculty have to work really hard when they provide them with their templates to make them inaccessible. They don't work that hard to make them inaccessible. They just use the accessible template, move on, and get their job done. So the partnerships have to happen everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And so let's take a hypothetical scenario where you were in a position to create your ideal institutional accessibility policy, and how to and you have free say over how that's implemented. What do you think that would look like? I know this might be a difficult one.
I would start by doing purchasing, because purchasing is where a majority of, very few campuses are doing in-house development anymore. It's just too costly. We can't afford it. So start by looking at your purchasing unit, train the purchasers on how to understand accessibility and how to look through and understand what inaccessibility and the costs of inaccessibility were. Then I would work with the upper management from the individual units across campus. So we're set up into multiple divisions at Berkeley, I would work with the senior leadership from each of those divisions and say, I want you to identify a person from every subunit of your unit that is responsible for communication, responsible for technology, and bring those people to the table and have those people learn about accessibility and have them be kind of the evangelists for their local unit. So what we found was very effective is that when we had our grassroots, volunteer group, they were from all over campus. They were from different units. We had, student co-ops, we had School of Engineering, we had library, and each of those people brought back to their own unit the information and the knowledge they needed. And so I would mandate from the top that people needed to be identified who had an interest, who could lead within their own units, and then those people would be specifically trained and provided with the resources that they needed, and then that there would be a coordinating position who would be responsible for creating new resources, new tools, and training. And that specifically, and I'm going to emphasize this, I emphasize this at every talk I make, I would then try and identify people within the community with disabilities, hire those people in specific key roles, because the most important thing to getting people to believe in accessibility is seeing the impact of inaccessibility. When I do a website review for a developer, and I insist that the developer be present as often as possible, they get very, they have pride in their work, and when they see that their work is failing for an individual because, they forgot to put a keyboard handler on something, it becomes their own passion, their own desire. So how's that for a dream?
That's amazing. That's great. And so Eric is also asking, so in your opinion, which is a more effective approach at embedding accessibility at an institution, top-down or grassroots, or a mixture of both?
Absolutely a mixture of both, because top-down has to be able to say this is important to us. They have to be able to provide the resources and the funding. Without my position, I don't think the campus could do very much about accessibility because they wouldn't have somebody who could advise on that area. Without somebody who is an expert in the field, and let's be frank, leadership has to provide the resources for that. It just doesn't exist without leadership saying, all right, a quarter FTE from every unit will be committed to this, or, we have a coordinator. So leadership needs to actually buy in and understand it. But grassroots is how the work gets done. Every one of us know our CIOs are not the ones doing the work. We're the ones doing the work. But if we don't have somebody who's passionate, who wants to learn and then share that information from the bottom up, we can't do it. So it's definitely a mix of both. We've got to get the leadership to give us the funding and the resources, but we have to do the work, and we have to have the passion and desire to do the work.
That makes sense. So wrapping up on policy and going outside of it again a little bit. So there was one additional question in chat, which was around some of the legal action that we've seen in this area. And so Matt's asking. Matt's saying that he has a concern that as these sort of legal cases around accessibility become more successful, he has seen some very questionable claims and lawsuits. And do you feel that legal action can eventually become paralyzing for an institution?
It can be paralyzing if you, let me see how to put this properly. I want to look at the most successful case as an example of what you should think, how you should think about a legal action. So I want to look at the University of Colorado Boulder. And they got their notice from the Department of Justice that they had a case pending and that there was investigations going on. And they immediately said, okay, we have a problem. How are we going to deal with it? And so what they did was they went out to their entire community and said, we have a problem and we need you all to help with it. And everybody pitched in and everybody worked on it. And their DOJ settlement came back very quickly with DOJ saying, we see how you've responded. We see how you've engaged your community. We see that you're making movement. Case closed. And that was a really positive resolution. You look at other institutions where DOJ comes in and they paralyze, and they end up spending more money defending themselves, and they end up spending more money kind of trying to fight that trend. In the industry, it's very strange to say, but we like to think of DOJ as our friend and our actual guide through this particular problem, because ultimately that's how we get those resources. Is DOJ points out there's a problem, the institution now gives us resources. And I'm not going to say I welcome a DOJ case for any of you, but I think you need to look at what they're doing at other institutions as your guidance and your leadership. And you need to kind of embrace it and think about it, because ultimately the reason they're coming up with the resolutions they're coming up with is that this is the formula that works. I hate the timelines that they've placed on some institutions. When I look at the fact that, an institution had to have a fully compliant process in 2 years, that's expensive. And then the reporting you have to do to say, this is, you spend half of your time doing what they want you to do, and the other half of the time reporting back to them saying, we are doing what you told us we had to do, where you could be spending all of your time on doing the task.
Excellent, thank you, Lucy. So we're close to the end. I wanted to sort of wrap up with more of a future-facing statement, I guess. And so I think we can all agree that in the last few years, accessibility has definitely sort of come to the forefront and has become a much more important priority for many institutions, and that's a very good thing to see happening. So if you think about the future, Lucy, where do you think there will be in let's say 5 years from now, and what are you sort of really excited about and seeing happening next?
So I'm really excited about STEM right now. I think we've got some major developments happening in the STEM world. It's truly exciting for me to see some of the work that's being done with math. I mean, many state laws still actually say that math and sciences are exempt from accessibility because the technology does not exist. I think the technology is going to exist. And I think that if we work with the people working on these technologies, we can actually have some really wonderful products very quickly and very soon. Getting instructors to teach with those tools and technologies, that's going to be the challenge. So, I've been working with a developer who's done some really fascinating work with statistics. And what I've done is I've, again, taken a professor who's very proud of their work in statistics and who has done some amazing work in statistics and said, and hey, if you work with this guy who's doing these statistical diagrams that are in an accessible format, your work's going to be 10 times better. And he looked at the diagrams, he goes, oh, but it's not showing the information exactly the way it should. I said, yeah, but that's because he's not a statistical expert. You are. You teach him how to do the statistics. He'll teach you how to do the accessibility, and the two of you will win the world. So I think that's going to be the real interesting future. Is right now we struggle with STEM in education. We try to figure out how do we get people with accessibility issues to actually access the information in STEM. And I think within the next 5 years, we're going to have the ability to do that. So our challenge is going to be, how do we get faculty to embrace those technologies? I mean, let's face it, a mathematician tends to be an old codger who doesn't want to stop using his chalkboard. We want them to now start using MathML and MathJax. How do we get them to do that?
What's your thinking on some of the sort of new technology that's popping up? Things like virtual reality. Are you concerned that accessibility is once again going to be an afterthought, or are you seeing changes in terms of mindset that accessibility is becoming more of a part of the process rather than an afterthought.
So this is why I work with Lighthouse Labs, is that we aggressively go after developers who are working on these new technologies and bring them in and try and think about it. So for example, we've had Microsoft there with their, what's their visor thing called? I can't remember right now, talking about virtual reality and how this virtual reality can work with people with disabilities. We've had other developers come and talk about the innovation of their product, and we're bringing that now. You know, we're streaming our events and we're starting to talk and hoping that we'll reach out to more of these developers who are working on these types of technologies, so that hopefully they understand what the impact is for people with disabilities and include us. It's a long process. It's going to take some time. The interesting thing is developers are thinking about accessibility earlier and earlier now. So the more of us who work on this, I don't know how many of you here know about Teach Access, but if we bring Teach Access to our schools, these students who will be creating things, if they learn about accessibility now, will include accessibility in their projects in the future. It's going to be an interesting next 5 years. I'm glad to be alive. I think that it's the future is bright, but the future is hard, and we're going to have to work on it. But if all of us don't dig in and don't try and convert a person every day to accessibility, that we could end up in a bad place. I don't see it. I don't think it's going to happen. I think we are going to have a much more accessible world because the leaders in technology are thinking about it, working on it. You know, every single major company in technology today is having a global accessibility day event. You know, Apple's had a week of events. They released a pile of videos yesterday on accessibility. Microsoft's accessibility team is getting aggressive about it. Google has had, you know, several sessions at Google I/O this week about accessibility. If they're thinking about accessibility and they're showcasing it at their big, you know, as their big thing, people are going to say, oh, if I don't know about this accessibility, I'm going to be left behind. And I think that's really important. You know, where I think we're going to have problems in the next couple of years too, though, is in legislation. I joke with everybody that, you know, my dream is for the autonomous car. Well, I also fear that when the autonomous car comes out, that legislators are going to say, as a blind person, I can't own one. And I won't accept that. I'll break the law if I have to have an autonomous car.
Okay, that's great, Lucy. I think that was a great positive message. I think that we can wrap up with, but also points to some of the things that we need to continue to be to take into account and be wary of. So we are at the end of the hour. So I think first of all, Lucy, I want to really thank you for going through all of this with us today. As always, extremely insightful. I hope there was some information in there that you can take forward at your individual institutions. I want to thank everyone for joining, for participating in the discussion and asking questions. I think that was really good. The recording for this session will be made available after this session, and then I would definitely encourage you to join our remaining Global Accessibility Awareness Days. And with that, thank you very much. Thank you, Lucy. And have
one last comment, though, Nico, is every single person on this call should go out and talk to 3 other people today that don't know about accessibility and share the word. Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Awesome. Thank you very much.